Gives me fabulous, great pleasure to introduce the editor of West Country Voices, Anthea Simmons, who will be in conversation with journalist, author, activist, and local celebrity, George Monbiot.
Wow, George, our local champion, fills the hall to capacity. It's fantastic. We're just going to start off. First of all, welcome everybody, and thank you, George, for giving up valuable Sunday family time. We're going to start by talking about the primary, because, as you might know, I'm one of the founders. And I'm delighted to say that Caroline Voden, who ended 100 years of Tory rule in this seat, majority of any Lib Dem MP to be elected in the county, and where the Tory and Reform vote would not have beaten her. And great turnout too. So that's anyway. George.
Yeah, I mean, it's an astonishing turnaround, and it is in very large part due to our fantastic Caroline Voden here, who did an amazing job. I mean, she's been so active in this constituency for so long, and such a powerful speaker, such well thought out positions. But it's also a result of a new model of organising. And in fact, we have another great hero of this model right here. Anthea and a small group of people within this constituency have pioneered a completely new way of doing politics, which is called the primary, the People's Primary, I think we can call it, South Devon Primary. Now, as Anthea says, we've had 101 years of Tory rule here. The latest iteration was one of those injection moulded Tories that they turn out by the dozen in the basement of Conservative Central Office. Same circuitry, same voice box. If you asked him which one are you, he wouldn't have been able to tell you. And it was just like, oh God, are we going to be stuck with these people forever? And this constituency had become what Neil Lawson, who was speaking here, I think, on Friday, calls a progressive tragedy. So a place where there's a majority against the Tories, but the Tories keep getting in because the majority is split between different parties. And it's one of the tragedies of our ridiculous first-past-the-post political system. And so the amazing pioneers of the primary, Anthea, and it was really just about three of you to start off with, wasn't it?
Simon and Ben, Simon Aldridge and Ben Long.
Yeah, so just these three really brilliant people, you know, I'm very proud that these geniuses live within our constituency, came up with this idea of why don't we, the constituents, take charge of this process and decide who the most effective candidate to beat the Tories is, and then try and get the whole constituency behind that candidate. And it was a huge amount of work, starting from scratch in a very hostile political environment. I mean, I think it's fair to say that all the major parties, all three of the major parties, expressed extreme hostility towards this idea. But Caroline was game, she was up for it. So was Robert Bagnell, the Green candidate here, and a big shout out to him for being so sporting. I mean, he knew he had an uphill battle, he knew he was unlikely to win, but he stuck with the primary process the whole way through. And I think he appreciated its value above and beyond whatever the outcome might be. And so the primary hosted a series of hustings around the constituency where the candidates who were up for it, it was Caroline and Robert, because Labour hadn't even come up with a candidate by then and were very hostile to the process, could put their case before the people as to why they should be the one to displace our injection moulded Tory MP. And there were 8 really great meetings, really, with very pertinent questions, very strong performances by both Caroline and Robert, laying out their suitability to be our MP. And at the end of that process, when all the votes were tallied up, we decided that Caroline, as a constituency, we decided that Caroline should be our sort of coalition candidate, our consensus candidate to take on the Tories. And then it was a question of rolling out the vote behind Caroline. And there was this huge effort, coordinated by the primary people across the constituency, to make sure that everyone knew she was the people's choice. And the result was one of the biggest swings we saw in the election. Anthony Bagnell, our previous MP, forever hereafter known as Anthony Mangold, had in 2019 a majority of 12,000. Caroline now has a majority of 7,000. I mean, it was a really major turnaround. And as I say, partly because we had a fantastic candidate, but partly because we had this new form of political organising behind her. The model has been proven, and it can now be rolled out in constituencies around the country to defeat the perversities of our first-past-the-post political system and bring in, hopefully, eventually, a suite of candidates who will sweep that system away and give us proportional representation.
Can I just say that in the meantime, we will pivot towards campaigning for proportional representation now, because we'd love to do it again, but it would be nice not to have to. It would be nice to have that system changed straight away. But while we're on first past the post and the results, George, what are your initial thoughts on the incoming Labour government, on the now Labour government?
I have more robust thoughts on the outgoing Tory government.
Yes, I'm sure.
It's more a sense of relief than anything else. It's this sort of escape from this 14-year Tory prison, and I think my feelings are quite reflective of those of the nation as a whole. That there's been a massive mandate for change, a massive mandate for getting rid of the Tories, but a sort of less than wholehearted enthusiasm for the new government which is replacing them. And what we've seen is this extraordinary phenomenon of a vast majority on a small mandate, which is worrying. That is concerning. And it suggests that, enormous as the Labour majority is, it's actually potentially quite a fragile one. And Labour has a short period in which to prove itself, to prove that it really can start to change social outcomes in this country, and environmental outcomes and economic outcomes. And the danger is that Starmer has offered very little. He's been extremely cautious. He's tried to triangulate in the approach to this election. In other words, what that means in effect is riding both horses, sort of trying to appeal to the people and saying, this is what you want, but also appealing to Rupert Murdoch and saying, we're going to give you what you want too. And that can't hold. You can't continue to ride those two horses. You're going to fall off one of them. And I think on just tomorrow, we're going to see the first impact of his appeal to oligarchic capital in his deregulation of the planning laws. There are many good ways of solving the housing crisis. That is not the way to do it. But that is the way to do it which preserves political structures. It preserves the structures of power. Similarly, there are many ways of raising revenue. The most effective way of raising revenue is to tax the rich. And in fact, there are two good reasons to tax the rich. One is to raise revenue. The other is to stop what Thomas Piketty calls the spiral of patrimonial wealth accumulation, which leads inexorably to plutocracy and oligarchy. And you have to tax the rich at high rates to prevent that from happening, otherwise you destroy your entire polity. Civilization rests on this thing which is demonized as tax and spend. Tax and spend, which is meant to be a terrible thing, is what creates civilized society. But rather than tax and spend, rather than tax the rich, Starmer has been saying, well, we'll go for growth, and that'll generate the money we need. Well, quite aside from one's environmental objections to infinite growth on a finite planet, it's a way of avoiding any confrontation with power. We can keep the power structures intact and just try to generate revenue from growth. Well, what you have to do to generate growth can often be very destructive environmentally and socially, but it means that unless you take on economic power, most of the product of that growth will continue to go into the hands of the rich. The rich will become still more powerful. Their economic power translates into political power, and that leads to plutocracy. And this is what we've been seeing all over the world. I mean, in the US, most terrifyingly, where we have a real prospect now of the most powerful nation on earth falling into the hands of fascist dictatorship. And unfortunately, Joe Biden is becoming a kind of one-man Weimar Republic who's just going to sort of open the way to this horrifying prospect. You have to be tough. You have to be tough in your opposition to the power of capital. And I fear that Keir Starmer is not nearly tough enough.
In a session on what Labour need to do yesterday in a group, Alexandra Hall emphasised the need for a complete root and branch appraisal of our governance system. And she made it clear that she thought that just changing to just having electoral reform and having proportional representation was not enough. Do you have views on that? Is that something you would appreciate?
Yes, very much so. I mean, what we call democracy is the thinnest and weakest form of democracy you could possibly get. So once every 5 years, we get to put a cross on a piece of paper. We have a 10-second engagement with democracy every 5 years. And in doing so, we are deemed to have consented to everything that might be in the winning party's manifesto, whether we voted for them or not, and everything else that they can get through Parliament in the next 5 years. In other words, the entire system is based on presumed consent. We don't accept presumed consent in sex. Why should we accept it in politics? There are many other ways of running a democracy. In fact, there are many democratic ways of running a democracy, which are at great variance with the way we organise ourselves today. And one of the most powerful forces we've seen in politics, in the very rare occasions where it's been allowed to operate, is deliberative participatory democracy. A classic standout example is what happened in Porto Alegre in southern Brazil between 1989 and 2014, when the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the PT government, had come into power in a city which had been completely captured by the mafia, in effect. A kind of economic mafia, clientelism, corruption governed the entire allocation of the municipal budget. And they said, what are we going to do about this? It's not enough just to overthrow the current lot of creeps, because another lot of creeps will come in and take their place. We're going to hand the budget to the people. And every year, the entire city of Porto Alegre came together to set the budget. And everyone said this is going to be a total catastrophe. It's going to be chaos. Aren't we always told that if we step away from conservative politics, it's going to be chaos? It's going to be chaos. It's going to be horrendous. But the extraordinary thing about participatory deliberative democracy is it works much better in practice than it does in theory. And the reason for that is that it transforms people into democratic citizens. The practice of democracy it kind of trains its participants until you begin to live and breathe it, and you take on the responsibilities that our representatives so seldom take on. And what we see consistently is that the results are fairer, greener, and more long-term than the results you get from representative democracy alone. And it had this transformative impact. I mean, it went from being this total basket case, Porto Alegre, to the city at the top of the Human Development Index in Brazil, It had massively improved primary healthcare, primary education, maternal mortality stats, infant mortality stats, sanitation, clean water, public transport, the whole works. And it led to this extraordinary result that any political scientist would tell you was impossible. People took to the streets with placards demanding that their taxes were raised.
I think we're beginning to move towards George's book, but I wanted to also just explore, in a way, the neoliberal network is a bit like the fungi that support the forests. They seem to be in everything and have infiltrated everything.
These are the fungi that kill the forest.
That kill the forest, yes, exactly. And one of the challenges we certainly found on the street is the degree of disaffection, the degree of people believing that all politicians are the same, that there's no point in voting, is something that's really, really, really worrying. And that's a real number that the neoliberals have worked on us, isn't it, really?
Yeah, neoliberalism is the honey fungus of politics. So neoliberalism is the means by which capital solves its biggest problem, the problem it's been struggling with for 150 years, and that's a problem called democracy. I mean, we call it democracy, but it really should be described as a problem called adults having the vote once every 5 years. Because as we just explained, it doesn't really equate to democracy, but voting is a big problem for capital, because when people vote, they vote for things which capital doesn't like. They vote to have a larger share of the value that their production creates. They vote for better terms and conditions at work. They vote for outrageous things like the weekend. They vote for not having their rivers filled with shit. They vote for not having their air filled with toxins. They vote for good, robust, publicly funded public services. They vote for a strong economic safety net. In other words, they vote for the redistribution of wealth from the rich to the rest. And these are things, unsurprisingly, that capital doesn't like. So capital has developed two main means of solving its fundamental problem, which is voting. One of those is called fascism. It's a very effective form, and behind every fascist movement there are extremely rich people pouring money in while remaining in the shadows. And the other is called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism was an idea. It was named in 1938 by a group of economists gathering in Paris, but it wasn't really formalized until 1944 with the publication of two books, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek and Bureaucracy by Ludwig von Mises. And in both of those books, which were extremely similar in their theme and argument, they claimed that any move towards a welfare state, any move towards robust public services, any move towards collective decision-making was a move towards totalitarianism. It would end up with a new Stalin or a new Hitler. It was the slippery slope fallacy writ large. And so what they said was there should be no interference in economic life by politics, that there is a natural hierarchy of winners and losers, and you can tell who the deserving are, who have the grace of the invisible hand pointing at them, because they're the ones with the money, and you can tell who the undeserving are because they're the ones without the money, and that's the way things should be. Inequality is a good thing. Selfishness and greed is a good thing. And this ideology, which they called proudly at the time neoliberalism, though they then went on to claim that it wasn't an ideology at all, that it shouldn't have a name because it was simply a description of the natural order, the way things were. We've discovered a natural law like gravity or natural selection. This thing which at the time they called neoliberalism was received with horror and disgust by the great majority of people, and it was considered very marginal, even though there was a lot of money put behind the publication. But there was a small group of people who thought it was the best thing they'd ever seen, and these were the richest people on earth, literally the richest people on earth, who poured huge amounts of money into creating what's been described as a neoliberal international. a vast network of think tanks, these dark money-funded lobby groups who operate on behalf of capital but refuse to say who's funding them, academic institutes, tame journalists, tame MPs and Congress people, tame government officials, and they poured money. First of all, through a vehicle called the Montpellerin Society, founded in 1947, but then through this ever-spreading network, coordinated by groups like the Atlas Network, for instance, but there are many more, to create effectively a new political story, whose aim was to create a new political consensus. And it took quite a long time to mature, because at the time we had pretty well a political consensus, and that was called Keynesian social democracy. In fact, Richard Nixon at one point said, "We are all Keynesians now." It was pretty well the received wisdom everywhere. Whether you were Democrat or Republican, whether you were Labour or Conservative, you were broadly Keynesian. We're going to have a robust public sector. We're going to spend money into the public sector in order to stimulate consumer demand, and in doing so, we sustain growth, and that's how we're going to run our economies. And that hit the buffers in the late 1970s. And by then, the neoliberals had been refining their story and turning the outrageous into what sounded like political common sense. And as their most prominent advocate, Milton Friedman, said, "When the time came, we were ready and we could step straight in." And they did. And they did so, well, first of all, they tested the model in Pinochet's Chile. As soon as Pinochet had overthrown Salvador Allende, the neoliberal economists who'd been trained at the University of Chicago, part of this Neoliberal International network, swept in and were able to implement the full suite of neoliberal reforms, the full Liz Truss program, without political opposition, because any political opposition was immediately killed and dropped out of helicopters and tortured to death in basements. That's how they liked it. You know, when Friedrich Hayek went to Chile, he was going around saying, yes, this is what we want. And he said, I would rather have what he called a liberal dictatorship. Apparently Pinochet was a liberal, than a democracy without the principles of economic liberalism, by which he meant neoliberalism. You know, it was clear where these people stood. But they couldn't quite do it in countries like ours, because military coup plotting is slightly more difficult here. One or two did try. But when Mrs. Thatcher came in 1979, they could do it by other means. And similarly, when Reagan came to power in the United States in 1980. And what we call Thatcherism or Reaganism or monetism or supply-side economics or laissez-faire economics, they're none of those things. It's all neoliberalism, and they were just the channels through which this very well-developed ideology was pushed. And the remarkable aspect of it is that it then became the social consensus in just the way that Keynesianism had been the social consensus before. So that even when we had changes of government, even when Tony Blair came to power or Bill Clinton came to power, their program was essentially still neoliberal. And they made a few modifications, they trimmed it in places, but you know, if you look at what New Labour did here, it did some good stuff. Minimum wage, sure start, you know, you can reel off a long list, but it also did some absolutely horrendous, straight down the line, totally unnecessary neoliberal stuff like the private finance initiative, and so many other things which eroded the capacity of the state to solve our problems, and then, you know, got carried away on its magic carpet of oligarchic power and ended up with the Iraq War. And unfortunately, you know, the danger is we're now seeing a repeat of that. Already, Keir Starmer is talking about having our public infrastructure built by BlackRock. Great move, mate. You know, have you learnt nothing from the fiasco of the private finance initiative under Tony Blair?
Which brings me neatly to the question is, what are the neoliberals going to be doing right now?
So their apogee in this country came with our 49-day premiership of this wonderful, inspiring figure who, as Marina Hyde said yesterday, not only unable to save the West, she couldn't even save Norfolk Southwest. And Liz Truss, the reason, I mean, you might wonder how on earth could someone like that become Prime Minister, right? And a lot of people have been wondering. She became Prime Minister because she was this totally empty vessel who could be filled by other people's ideas. And she was the creature of Tufton Street, of these dark money junk tanks, who completely shaped her agenda and became her most trusted advisors and were the people who formed her policy units when she got into power. The Institute of Economic Ideas, Centre for Policy Studies, the Taxpayers Alliance, the Adam Smith Institute, Policy Exchange, these were the people who shaped Liz Truss, and these were the people who she gave key positions in her administration to when she got into power. And they were the people who wrote her mini budget. It was an extraordinary thing. On the day of the mini budget, you saw them all coming up on social media and saying, we did this, look at this, everything we asked for is right here. And the next day, they were saying, who were the bloody idiots who did that? And the amazing thing is they've never been properly held to account for it. Because the BBC is enthralled to these people, utterly enthralled to them. Peter Gergen calculated that they were on the media on average 14 times a day last year. And immediately after the budget they had written, they were invited into the BBC studios to comment on it as if they were dispassionate observers. And they were saying a combination of, it didn't go far enough and it wasn't properly implemented, rather than the obvious truth, it was an appalling set of ideas which was never going to fly, which we authored. And it's just, so they're given endless opportunity within the media. Just as the BBC created Nigel Farage out of whole cloth, created Boris Johnson out of whole cloth, it has foamed the runway for the neoliberal junk tanks, and they continue to dominate the public conversation, not because of any virtue on their part, but because there are senior management at the BBC who want them there. It's not just Robbie Gibb, there's a whole series of senior managers who have that perspective. And far from being the balanced, impartial, unbiased organisation it's supposed to be, they are completely beholden. So they're going to keep pushing. They're going to just carry on as if nothing happened, as if there were no mini budget, as if all their ideas didn't go up in a puff of smoke in 2008 and in 2019 and in 2021 and now in 2024, as if they can just carry on the way it's always been. And they will, because despite the fact that neoliberalism is economically bankrupt, intellectually bankrupt, morally bankrupt, socially bankrupt, it is the zombie that keeps walking because it has the consent of capital. And in any competition between what we want and what we need, and what capital wants and what capital needs, the default position is that capital wins. We have this mythology that our political default is this magic thing we call democracy, which would be a nice thing to have, but we've never quite seen it yet. But that somehow, we'll can relax back, now that we've got rid of the Tories, into a democratic state of better distribution and better public services and stuff. There's no relaxing back into that state. We look back to what the French call les Trente Glorieuses, 1945 to 1975. We look back at that as being the default state of politics. It's the most anomalous politics in the history of humanity. There was never anything like it before, and there's never been anything like it since. And it happened because the Second World War broke the power of oligarchic capital. But slowly that power begins to regroup. We've been living off the back of that legacy, but it's now disappearing. And you don't revive social democracy, or you don't revive a fairer settlement, whatever it might be, by accident. Good things don't happen by themselves. They have to be fought for and fought for and fought for, relentlessly. Otherwise, the Rupert Murdochs of this world and the Tufton Street weirdos and all the other creepy forces of backed by the sinister rich will dominate again.
One of the things you talk about at length was Brexit and the weaponisation of Brexit and othering. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
So I see Brexit as one outcome of a civil war within capitalism. And there have been many attempts to explain Brexit, and most of them seem to be locked into the smoke screen that the Brexiters like Johnson and Farage and others used to disguise what was really going on. The smoke screen was, it's about immigration, it's about straight bananas, it's about small condoms and all the other mythology surrounding the European Union. But it wasn't about that at all. What capital is always trying to do is to rid itself of constraints. It wants to be unconstrained. It doesn't like tax, it doesn't like regulation, it doesn't like democracy, it doesn't like the people having a say. It wants to be free of all that. It wants to exit all that. But there are degrees to which it wants it, and there are different ways in which it wants that to happen. So I divide capital into two categories, the house-trained capitalists and the warlord capitalists. And the house-trained capitalists are represented by organisations like the CBI, for instance, the Confederation of British Industry. They can tolerate a little bit of voting, they can tolerate a tiny amount of political choice, very, very constrained, very limited. They want stable, secure, predictable politics. They want boring, managerial, technocratic people in charge because they represent companies which have a 5-year or a 10-year horizon. They want to be able to plan securely in order to make sure that their investments mature. Right, so that's house-trained capital. Warlord capital are represented by people like Robert Mercer or Elon Musk or Jeremy Hosking or Paul Marshall. A lot of them are into private equity, into hedge funds, into shorting. Crispin Odey is another example. Ian Hargreaves, there's plenty of them. And these are people who want to smash the system. They want to break everything up because they can profit from the ruins. They can basically privateer on the back of whatever broken system we got. So in Steve Bannon's words, and Steve Bannon is a sort of channel for warlord capital, they want to deconstruct the administrative state. In fact, he got the word wrong. He meant destroy, but he's, unless he's some French structuralist, he was actually, he meant destroy the administrative state. That's what they want to do, because the administrative state it stands in the way of that ability to apply shock doctrine methods, rip down political structures, rip down economic structures, and then sell off the assets. They're basically asset strippers operating on the national level. Right. And so these two factions within capital were at loggerheads, and they were represented by different factions within the Conservative Party. So you had the sort of the staid and stolid house-trained capital bloc who are seen as the Tory centrists, and then you had the wild and crazy warlord capitalist bloc who are seen as the radical right, the ERG and the rest of it within the Tory party. And they ripped each other apart because one of them wanted stability and one of them wanted to smash everything up. It's Ian Hargreaves from Lansdowne Hargreaves, who poured a huge amount into the Leave campaign, said, Brexit will be wonderful because we'll be insecure again, and insecurity is fantastic. He won't be insecure, but the rest of us, with our jobs ripped apart, with the economic safety net ripped apart, are going to be very insecure, and sure, this is how it's worked out, and he can mop up in a situation like that. And so we were just cannon fodder. We were just sitting between these forces as they duked it out. But we were convinced that it was about something else entirely, that we were escaping from entirely different forces. We were escaping into the arms of an even more ruthless form of capital.
And unfortunately, those people who still stick with the Brexit myth and at the sort of grassroots ordinary level feel that that was the last moment where they had a little victory, where they were appreciated and given a voice.
Yeah, I mean, it's very true. I mean, it was the first opportunity that many people had to make a genuinely powerful decision, a really big and meaningful decision. And if you voted Remain, you were effectively throwing away that opportunity because you were just saying, oh, my decision is for things to carry on as they are. And voting Leave was the first time you could say, oh, I can do something. I can actually see the results of my vote. And so even if you didn't know anything about it, you weren't inclined particularly in either way, you were given an opportunity for no power at all, or a tiny feeling of power for one moment, the first time in your life and probably the last time in your life. What were you going to take?
And this is what Reform's captured too, hasn't it? This feeling of, this is the voice of the common man, this is the voice of the silenced, alleged majority of people who have been ignored and cast aside by the most elite, exploitative people on the planet. It's very, very scary.
Well, and the far right is always a con. It's a massive, great con which persuades you, we're going to do politics differently. We're going to kick over this massive, corrupt sandcastle where all these self-serving politicians are just in it for themselves and not for you, and they're all operating corruptly at someone else's behest. The elite, the establishment, but boy, the far right is far more elite and establishment. These are the people who are backed by the dirtiest money, and often it's much harder to see who's backing far right movements than it is even backing conventional right movements. It's just another way for capital to solve its abiding problem of voting, voters, but it's very seductive when politics as usual has not solved people's problems. And it has not solved people's problems because it has cohered around a neoliberal consensus. And the neoliberal consensus is that politics should not solve people's problems. It has been described very well by William Davies at Goldsmiths as the disenchantment of politics by economics. And what neoliberalism tells you is that there should not be choice within the political sphere. All the choice should be within the economic sphere. And you can make your decisions through buying and selling, through consumer democracy in the market. Now, all of these things cover a whole host of hidden meanings. I mean, what they call the market means economic power. And what economic power means is the power of the people who got most of it, the power of the rich. What they call consumer democracy is a system where some people have thousands of times more votes than others. When they redefine us as consumers, they're telling us you are alone. As citizens, we're powerful, we come together, but you're consumers. You can change things by buying a different brand of biscuits. One, that never changed anything, but two, that situates you at home by yourself, making decisions in isolation. And that never changed anything either. They are atomizing in order to rule. It's a system of atomize and rule. But because we are all neoliberals now, we absorb that. We believe that. People who are rich believe that they are the authors of their good fortune, the self-attribution fallacy. People who are poor come to believe that they're the authors of their misfortune because they're constantly being blamed. If you're poor, it's because you're feckless and unenterprising. If your credit card is maxed out, it's not because you're paying impossible levels of rent, it's because you're bad at managing your money. If your kid is fat, it's not because the school sold off its playing fields and you're living in a food desert, it's because you're a bad parent. There's endless blame, all directed downwards, whereas, it distracts from what the people at the top are responsible for.
And as we cannon towards climate breakdown, you make the point that the dirtiest companies on the planet are the ones who will pay the most to corrupt our politics.
Yeah, it's something I call the pollution paradox, and I think it's impossible to understand politics without understanding the pollution paradox. And the pollution paradox, as Anthea says, works like this. The most damaging, antisocial, dirty and dangerous economic interests are the ones with the greatest incentive to invest in politics, because otherwise, when people vote, they will vote for these interests to be regulated out of existence. You know, we don't want privatized water companies filling our rivers with shit, right? Is anyone here? Sorry, I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here. Is there anyone here who does want privatized water companies to fill our rivers with shit? Thought not. We don't want the planet burnt to a cinder. We don't want the sort of economic interests I've just been talking about dominating our politics. And given a choice, if it's put to the political choice, we would say, this is what we do not want. And in fact, one of the reasons, I don't know if Caroline would agree with this, but that the Lib Dems have done so well, is that they've been emphasising river pollution and other outrageous assaults on the public domain by rapacious capital. And of course, rapacious capital doesn't like this one bit. So it pours money into politics to try to buy politicians and political parties and political outcomes wholesale in order to stop what would inevitably be its own extinction if democracy were allowed to happen as we might wish. And the paradoxical result of this is that politics comes to be dominated by the dirtiest and most antisocial capital interests.
Before we open it up to the floor, I just want to ask you, why do we put up with this? What is it about the Brits? Is it because of serfdom, empire, class system? Why do we put up with it, and what do we do to fight back?
It's a very good question, Anthea, one that I'm constantly struck by. And I think part of it is a kind of inherited fear. It's not long ago that if someone stood up in public and said the sort of things I'm saying, they'd be taken to the assizes and they would be hung, drawn and quartered. We have had millennia of terror in this country, well, at least since 1066 and probably some time before, but where we've basically been an occupied country, occupied by, first of all, sort of the forces of conquest and aristocracy, and then that sort of gradually gets supplanted by a different form of conquest, the conquest by capital, and it's a terror which is almost soaked into the fabric of our being, and one we find very hard to shake off. We haven't got used to the fact that you don't get killed for speaking out. Of course, one of the many aspects of neoliberalism is that it tries to stamp out dissent, and hence we've seen this huge raft of new anti-protest laws and anti-trade union laws come in during the neoliberal era. And so they're trying to sort of reinstate some element of that terror. And there's no limits to how far they would take it if they could. They saw Pinochet's Chile as the ideal form of political organization, and that's where they will take it if they can. And so now they will put their weight behind political movements which can get there as quickly as possible. And we're in a very dangerous situation. Capital is backing Trump in a very big way, and he will deliver that. He could turn the US into a kind of Chile. Those militias that back him will become death squads on the Colombian model if Trump gets into power. He won't even have to bring the army to bear. They will just go around killing people who stand out and dissent. So we've got, we're in a very perilous situation here. We're restrained by deep fear. I think we also just get mesmerized by whatever the dominant ideology is. For better or worse, most people, most of the time, side with the status quo, whatever it might be. There's power in that, because, and maybe we'll come on to this, when the status quo is perceived to have changed, you can get very rapid social and political change as a result of that. But we do conform. You know, our tendency is to go along with the crowd. We are the hypersocial mammal. We don't want to be left behind. And so we find ourselves conforming to a situation which can be radically against our own interests.
So what do we do, George?
Well, so yeah,
just like to solve the problem. Yeah.
Well, this leads to the hopeful side of it, because of that tendency, combined with something which is the most important fact about society and the one you never hear outside of these hallowed precincts, is that society is a complex system. Now, this has massive, enormous ramifications. So, one of the greatest failings of our education is that scarcely any of us, even at university level, are taught the principles of complex systems. We're taught about complex systems, such as society, such as the economy, such as the financial system, such as ecosystems, such as soil, such as the atmosphere, such as the oceans, but we're taught about them as if they were simple systems. We're taught about them with circuit diagrams, you know, like with a plumbing system or an electricity system, but they don't work like that at all. They work on totally different principles. A complex system is a result of billions of random interactions forming patterns which can then generate feedback loops, which are either negative feedback, stabilizing within a particular equilibrium state, or positive feedback, driving the system towards a tipping point, towards a different equilibrium state. If society were a simple system, as we've all been taught it was, completely misleadingly, it's like being taught maths and told it's Finnish. If society were a complex system, were a simple system rather, it would only change in a linear, gradual and granular fashion. And no significant change has ever happened that way. It's happened through sudden rupture. It's happened through tipping points, and it tips from one equilibrium position to another one. And society is a complex system with two equilibrium positions. One's called impossible, and the other is called inevitable. And from the point of view of anything that we want to see change, it's always impossible. Votes for women, you have to be joking. They'll never let that happen. Decolonisation, you must be off your rocker. Civil rights, equal marriage, an end to smoking in public places, whatever it is, it's always impossible. Always. You know, and all the things we want to see happen right now are always impossible. We just see this huge brick wall of opposition and we think we'll never persuade everyone that that is what we need to do and that's where we need to be. But what systems theory tells you is you don't have to persuade everyone. That's not how it works. You'll see this enormous, impossible situation. You know, votes for women, it's just utterly impossible. And then it happens, and everyone says, well, that was inevitable, wasn't it? It's flipped. It's gone from being impossible to inevitable. It's flipped to the other equilibrium state. How does this happen? Well, it happens, in every case, by a small group of dedicated people, first of all, being sure of what they want, creating a strategy for how they get what they want, and telling a story of what that change looks like. And the story is very important. And having developed a good story of that, they do what I've been told throughout my entire career I should never do, which is to preach to the choir. Who the hell else is going to listen to you? Yeah. Of course you preach to the choir. I mean, we've got this Oxford Union model of how political change happens, which is that you persuade the person in the opposite corner by the sheer power of your reason and your rhetoric that you are right and they are wrong. Has that ever happened in the history of humanity? Is that how change happens? Of course it's not. It never happens that way. This is the folklore of political change. No, you preach to the choir, but you make that choir a little bit bigger every time. It's concentric circles. You reach the people who are halfway there already, who are sympathetic, who are ready to listen, and you say, this is what we can do. If we get together, and by the way, I want you to be a bit more radical than you are at the moment, and want a bit more. And I want you to go out and reach the next circle, the people who are closest to you. And you push it outwards and push it outwards. And it's a young science. There's still a lot more work to be done. But so far, it looks like the tipping point is about 25%. If you can push that circle outwards until you've got 25% of the population inside it, wanting that significant change, then two things happen. First of all, you get that social tipping that you'll get in any complex system, a tipping point between one equilibrium state and the other. But secondly, that's massively reinforced in a social system by the fact that we are the uber-social mammals and our whiskers are always twitching to see which way the social wind is blowing, and we don't want to be left behind. It's like after the Second World War, everyone became a member of the resistance, right? You go around France, every town has got a place de la résistance. There's no place de la collaborateur. I know someone, I can think of someone right now who says, well, of course, I've always believed in equal marriage. You think, no, you didn't. You thought equal marriage was going to be the end of civilization as we know it. But let them believe that. That's fine. It's not a question of persuasion. Persuasion happens within those concentric circles, but beyond that, it's just social consensus. People don't think about it. It's not a conscious change. They just, oh, this is the status quo, here I am. They just go along with wherever it is. And if people want to believe that, they always believe that, let them believe it. That's just fine. And so the question is, first of all, exactly what we want, being absolutely clear about what we want. Secondly, being clear about how systems work, how to push outwards until you reach that tipping point. Thirdly, to tell a coherent story, which I call around a particular narrative structure that always works in politics, and I call the restoration story, to show people where they stand, why they are there, where they want to go, and how they're going to get there. Absolutely crucial. And the biggest question this leaves us with, perhaps the biggest question humanity has ever faced, is whether we can hit the social tipping points before we hit the environmental tipping points.
We've got 10 minutes for questions, and when we finish, I'm afraid I'm going to whisk George straight off, so I know people want to mob him, and we've got a big fan club here, but he's going straight to the bookshop to sign copies of this book, which I really, really recommend. I've now listened to it 4 times on Audible, and I've read it a couple of times, and it is brilliant and worrying, but also hopeful. So if we could just if I could please ask you to ask a question, not make a big statement, because we're obviously very short of time.
Just one thing, the gallery gets very truculent if they get excluded. So
yes.
Can I suggest we go there first?
Yeah, let's go to the gallery
Please
first.
Project.
Right, has somebody got to go? Right, yes, there's a lady.
Yes,
yeah.
You, sir. Let's.
Sorry.
Thank you. Very interesting, important question. I think a lot of people around here are painfully aware of just how powerful this form of rentier capital is, where there's a whole load of fees and tithes and taxes that you have to pay to the royal family, effectively just to exist. There are large areas of land and seabed. If people want to moor their boat in the Dart estuary, to drop that concrete, lump of concrete or that anchor over the side of the boat, they have to pay a fee to the Duchy of Cornwall. And what we see here is one form of capital exploitation. It's rentier capital. But if I can just circle back to the way you started the question, a very important way, the devil's greatest trick is persuading us he doesn't exist. It's the case in so many ways. The neoliberals try to persuade us they don't exist. This is just a natural law. It's just the way it is. Capitalism tries to persuade us that, this is the way humanity has organized itself forever. There's nothing to see here. Whereas, we date it to a very specific place and time, 1450 on the island of Madeira. Before then, there was no such thing as capitalism. It was invented there and then, and it became a wholly new form of economic organisation. We're constantly being told this does not exist. We're constantly being told there is no such phenomenon. And one of the things which all those of us who are committed to a better world, a new system, have to do is to pull away these veils.
Thank you. I've thought for a long time that PR would be giving me and everyone more say in how things work. But there's been a lot of concern expressed lately about how the far right would get much more power, much more MPs. What do you think about that?
Thank you. Yeah, very pertinent question, especially now. I mean, as you can imagine, I'm no fan of Vichy Nige, who has collaborator running through him like a stick of rock, this loyal servant of offshore capital and foreign autocrats. But, they have a reasonable point where they say we got 4 million votes and only 5 seats. I think they got more votes than the Liberal Democrats, who got 72. Horrific as the prospect of them having a foothold in politics is, if you sign up to this system of voting, it should be a fair system, and we, have to sign up to the consequences of whatever that fairness might be, and fight them on fair grounds, fight them by fair means, even though they have no such intention towards us, because in doing so, we build the society we want to see. If we commit to an unfair system, an unfair society, because we think it's going to serve us, and this is unfortunately what the Labour Party has done for a very long time with its commitment to first past the post, then we can't complain when that system comes around and bites us on the arse. We have to make the society that we want to see, and in pressing for PR, it should be equal opportunity for all parties. And if we don't want to see the far right get a foothold, then you fight the far right. You don't fight the system which will give us a fairer politics.
How do you think the carbon oligarchs and the ultra-capitalists, the unhouse-trained ones, think their children and grandchildren will live? How can they imagine a future that they're destroying?
Thank you. These are all excellent questions, by the way, and another very pertinent one, and one which I can't help raising in my own mind almost every day. It's like, what are they thinking? And to a large extent, they're not thinking. We're far too ready to ascribe to people rational thought processes. We've got to realise that the system we subscribe to, the dominant system, is based on magical thinking. So the idea of infinite growth on a finite planet is magical thinking. The idea that this system of one vote every 5 years delivering the will of the people is magical thinking. Everything that dominates our society, that dominates our mindset, is magical thinking. And this is ramped up, in particular, amongst the exploiter classes, among the sinister rich, because without magical thinking, they would just fall apart. They would not be able to sustain their minds. They would succumb to cognitive dissonance. They would be aware of what's going on. And so there's a whole infrastructure, an ideological infrastructure, which persuades them that they are the good guys. And you can find it in Friedrich Hayek's writing, particularly his 1960 book, The Constitution of Liberty, which is just a massive great hymn to the outrages of the rich. And however you got your wealth, whether you inherited it, whether you earned it, whether you stole it, you are the worthy people, and everything you do is good, and everything the poor do is bad. We see it in Ayn Rand's books, like Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, which are kind of the fictional equivalent of Friedrich Hayek's supposedly non-fiction books. And you create this infrastructure of justification. And it's, the Nazis thought they were the good guys. The famous Mitchell and Webb sketch. It's like, what if we're the bad guys? But everyone thinks they're the good guys because they have this justification, this apparatus of justification surrounding themselves. And so they blot out those questions. They blot out those considerations, and they assume that magically, through the invisible hand of the market, this other massive construct of magical thinking, everything's going to work out just fine, and because we're generating money, we're the ones who are powering the invisible hand of the market, which distributes goods to everyone. And if anyone like us stands up and say, actually it doesn't work like that, you are the enemy and you are to be cast into the outer darkness.
We've got time for just one more question.
Sorry about this.
Hi there, George.
Talk too much.
With the new Labour government, what are your thoughts now on climate activism? So Chris Packham was talking yesterday about Just Stop Oil very much getting the attention but not getting the message across. So where do you think Just Stop Oil fits now with Labour Party, and how does that balance with the more moderate side of climate activism like Rupert Reed and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so every effective movement is an ecosystem, and we need lots of different people doing different things. We need people bringing their own particular skill set to the fore. We think of a mobilization of a movement as being people sitting in the street, and absolutely we need that. And we need dramatic, spectacular actions which people can see and gets people talking. But you also need your radical lawyers and your radical accountants and your radical administrators, and you need this entire infrastructure of people with particular skill sets, people who have knowledge of the systems we're trying to overthrow, people who understand how stuff works, people who've got that entire suite of skills, including foot soldiers of the revolution, or of the rebellion rather. We need people who are just going to slug it out bit by bit, doing the really difficult stuff, putting things in envelopes, the stuff which isn't very glamorous, organising local meetings, whatever it might be, because they're all essential parts of that ecosystem of change. And I feel it would be completely wrong to say there is only one tactic, there is only one approach. We need a great plethora of approaches if we're going to confront the greatest predicament that humankind has ever faced. Now, with Starmer, we have more opportunity than we did under the Tories. I think Ed Miliband in particular is quite sympathetic to a lot of the things that people like me would like to see happen. Steve Reed to an extent perhaps as well. They have committed to certain improved policies, but what we're not seeing is them matching policy to science. Scientific findings should guide your policy on climate and environmental action. And we're way off what scientific findings are telling us at the moment. And so as a result, we, the citizens, need to step up our action and mobilise on a much greater scale than we've done before. And especially now that we might be pushing on a slightly more open door than we were before, we have to take advantage of this opportunity because it might close up very soon. And we have to remember at all times, politics is vested in us. Politics is not something that takes place once every 5 years. Politics is something that takes place every minute of every day. This is politics. We are currently engaging in politics. You can't remove yourself from politics. You can't say, I don't do politics. You are doing politics. Just by saying that is a highly political statement because you're basically siding with the status quo. You're basically just going with the flow. You can't say, I'm above it all. I'm not left, I'm not right, I'm nothing. No, we're all in this. We're all in this together. And there are some people who are stepping up to their responsibility and some people who are not. And what we need to do within our widening concentric circles of change is to get as many people as possible to step up.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have your mission. That's what Byline is all about. Push out those circles of engagement and collaboration and influence.
Yeah. That is your call to action. Please answer it. We've just won a battle. We have not won the war by any means. Thank you very much, George. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you, Anthea, for today and for all your work.